Hey there, so today's video is going to be a big meta review. I'm going to go through all the archetypes, kind of talk about what they bring to the table. I'll be going over deck combinations in those archetypes. I'll even have some sample deck lists thrown in there. Now, this is not going to be a deck list review video, so I'm not going to be doing a deep dive into deck lists, but I'll throw in some samples. I'm also working on some versions of these decks, which of course you can find either on this YouTube channel if I make guides for them there, or on my Patreon, which has both a free and subscription version if you want to check out even more content that I'm making. Before we get going, please click that subscribe button. So close to 3K, it would be really awesome to hit it off of this video. All right, so first up, the breakdown. So the way I think of this is as 5 major pillars. I know it's kind of vague. The archetypes kind of blend together at points too in this game. So like, oh, aggro and small mid-range, what's really the difference? But this is kind of how I think about it and how I see decks fitting into like very specific archetypes. So aggro is probably like the simplest to explain. These decks minimally interact with their opponent. They are usually the ones presenting problems for their opponent. Now, of course, no deck or no archetype can function solely without interaction. Even aggro decks, even the main aggro decks in this format do still need to interact with their opponent. But these decks very much focus on getting their opponent dead as quickly as possible, and that's what fits them in aggro. The second bucket is mid-range, but I feel like that is too small of a pillar, so I've kind of broken it up into 2 different ones, a small mid-range and a big mid-range, where I differentiate them mostly based on how quickly, again, they want to end the game, but also how minimal investment they have in a top end. Small mid-range decks tend to have less of a grindy aspect to them. They're not trying to go for a major card advantage win. They will try to be bigger than the aggro decks, interact with those decks, but still present threats in an efficient manner and try to end a game in a respectable amount of time. While big mid-range decks are definitely some of the grindiest decks in the game. They do build a card advantage engine a lot of the times. A lot of these decks are also big ramp decks. And they, although are not control decks because they're not playing tons of removal, they still can sometimes just outgrind control decks. Then we go into the control pillar, which again I've split into 2 between soft and hard control. And these decks do play a lot of removal. They are there to interact with what their opponent is doing almost exclusively. I differentiate between soft and hard based on in what fashion they're trying to interact. So soft control decks are still primarily unit-based decks, like the Sabine Green that I recently played with. That was a 35 unit deck, I believe, at 15 events. The control aspect of it is, yes, 1-for-1 removal with events, but also using your units to create multiple trades. Think things like Vader, right, which typically will be able to create 2 or 3-for-1s on board. Whereas the hard control decks are much more event-based. These dig much deeper into like Super Laser Blast as their hard reset. These decks typically will also feature a mill win condition through Vigilance and Restock. They are probably the decks most likely to go to time in a tournament because they have very little in the way of endgame threats to actually like defeat their opponent through pure combat damage. Now, it'll still happen, but these decks definitely are the slowest in the game. All right, so we're gonna go through each of these pillars now, and I'm gonna like showcase some decks. Now, I'm not gonna put deck lists for everything. In the aggro bucket, I actually do have a sample deck list for all of these. We've got at the top there Energy Conversion Lab with Sabine, probably the premier aggro deck. Boba Fett yellow, the other one, right? I think some people put that in the mid-range area. I think it's very clearly an aggro deck. I think it's quicker than Sabine sometimes. It's trying to get their opponent dead. The interaction in it is tempo based. It's just bounce, right? That's typically how that deck interacts. Bounce, deploy, right? It gets ahead with the bounce because of Boba's ability. These are two of the strongest decks in the game as well, and anytime you're building something in this meta, you need to look at both of these decks and say, can I beat them? And if I'm not beating one of them, can I make it so I don't lose horribly to it, right? If you're losing to both of these decks, I don't think your deck is viable right now. If you're beating one of them and losing to the other, it really depends on how badly you're losing to the other. On the row below that, we've got two less popular decks, although they might rise in popularity. We got ECL Han. So this is a deck that I'll have a sample of it. It got a first and second place finish at a 60-person tournament in Poland. It's also very aggressive. It looks pretty similar to a Sabine deck. And then we've got the Kylo yellow deck. Now the Kylo yellow deck, there is a version that I'll show that's very level 1, the fastest I can defeat my opponent. This deck is significantly faster than Sabine, so if you ever want to make Sabine play control, that's what Kylo's for. But it is a bit of a glass cannon as currently constructed, but I'm working on a Kylo version that I think does present some avenues to win into decks featuring more interaction. All right, so yeah, here's a Sabine Green. This was piloted by my teammate Justin at Gen Con. It is a very powerful deck. Darksaber giving it a new element that it didn't have in set 1, and the big boys at the top, Poe and Wrecker, are kind of like the nails. These decks still interact, right? Energy Conversion Lab is the main way it interacts. That's how it gains tempo through its big drops. But as a whole, this is a very efficient and very powerful get 'em dead sort of deck. This is an example of the mono yellow Boba. This took first place at day 3 at Gen Con. Again, it is a deck trying to get their opponent dead. Its interaction is limited to basically bouncing their opponent's cards, which then generates resources for Boba so it can continue to deploy. This deck is incredibly fast, sometimes faster than Sabine. Often Sabine's best strategy for beating a Boba is actually to use their units to trade early to keep Boba's tempo down, so that once the late game reaches, once we get to a late game state, Sabine actually might be presenting a better end game. They've got 3 Poes and 3 Wreckers. Boba's list caps at, this one has Zuckuss and Fet's Fire Spray, but I would say Poe Wrecker is probably a more devastating end game, especially when combined with something like Timely Reinforcements out of the Sabine deck. So again, those 2 decks are 2 of the most important decks for you to be prepping for in a tournament. Here's that example of the Han Green. This one's by Betten, but his buddy Sip, who they have a channel, I think it's SW Swoop Racers, and they have a guide for this deck there. This is a Weenie Rush version of Green Han. I think you can actually make this deck less Weenie Rush as well if you don't want to play as many 1-drops and want to maybe even play things like Fleet Lieutenant, because this deck is very rebel-centric. The top end, as you can see, is still pretty similar to a Sabine's. It's got the 3 Poe, 3 Wreckers. It's playing for a cause. Like, a lot of the cards here overlap there. What this does differently, obviously, is they can deploy more threats quicker through Han's ability, but it gets the less powerful big oomph play of like a turn 3 leader, right? This doesn't have a turn 3 leader. It's a turn 4 leader that actually hits for the same amount of damage as Sabine. So you're really digging into the fact that you can deploy more and quicker with this deck at the cost of losing that hero bump. But again, you can also deploy your big units early in this deck, like Wrecker and Poe if needed. So it does offer some really strong top end, combined with the ability to do like a 3/1 drop turn 1. That's, I think, why the Maz Kanata is in this list. But look to experiment with this too. You don't have to play this as a Weenie Rush. I think this would be a very good deck, even if just played like more like a Sabine deck and less as a turbo go wide deck. And the last one from this bucket, this is a Kylo yellow deck that went 5-2 at Gen Con at day 2. This is Turbo Aggro. This is probably the quickest kill you can probably get. You've got like giant Toro combos with bounty hunters. You got a ton of buffs, a lot of smuggle, a ton of really cheap units. You're just dumping your hand. It's going to be empty on turn 3, and you're going to try to hit with Kylo for 5, and then go from there. I'm working on a version of this that is less digging into the 1-drop. It's going to have way less. It's going to have more sturdy units, more shielded units, and a bit more of a middle area there where, like, if you don't instantly get disrupted on the first couple turns or get overwhelming barraged, you might still be able to come back from that. But as a whole, I think this is kind of a good level 1 to look at if you want to just like see how fast a deck can do 25 or 30 damage, because this is where I'd look if all you want to do is play for 4 minutes and then go grab a bite to eat. All right, next is small mid-range. A little arbitrary distinction, but at the top here, we got the mono yellow Han, which does look to interact a little more than the mono yellow Boba, right? You got the bounce, but you also have hand attack in this deck. It's a bit grindier. It plays cards like Tech, obviously. There's the DJ combo in it. This deck has been performing pretty well. You got Boba Green here, which is like, a slower version of mono yellow Boba. It's going up to Maul to be a finisher. It plays Overwhelming Barrage as more interaction, but it's still not like a big grindy deck, even though it does feature ramp. Then we got like Boss Green, which again, it is a rampy deck, but I don't like the top end for the Boss Green deck is nowhere near what it would be for like a Vader or a Palpatine deck, at least because the leader itself is pushing you to build more aggressive and more to the board early. So it kind of fits in this pillar for me. You got Mono Red Han, not a very popular build right now, a deck that I like quite a bit. But again, it actually is slower than something like the Green Han I just showed. It's adding cards like Aggression and Rancor. Those are like the main features of the double red deck, and those are both actually pretty reactive cards. They're at their best when they're reacting to their opponent and doing something good in that state. And Cad Bane, Tarkin Town, something I'm also looking at right now to be a little bit reactive to some of those earlier decks. You got a lot of ambush in this deck. You got Tarkin Town and pings to help control the early game. Things like Relentless Pursuit is really strong on Cad Bane because it can hit 6-drop units, something that it can't do in the Boba Fett deck. So, right, it can snipe out things like Ruthless Raider and Fett's Fire Spray and Wreckers if needed. Now, those decks, like the last two I just spoke about, not super popular right now. I don't think you really need to metagame for them, but I just wanted to throw in a few other examples here for decks that could fit in this kind of small mid-range pile. And I've only got 2 samples here. I wanted to show off the mono yellow Han that won day 1 at Gen Con, then also finished 6-1 at Gen Con. It's by Troy, and he has a YouTube channel where he talks about this deck. And yeah, it's a pretty grindy deck. It's got Tex, it's got DJ, it's got a bunch of smuggle cards like the Leet Droid, and also like it's throwing in a jetpack in there, so he gets a little more reach out of the smuggled row. Now it's not built to be a super late game deck. It still needs to win at a respectable pace because its top end is just nothing close to what you would see out of big mid-range decks, like cards like Home 1, or even like the control decks that they start like chaining Snokes and Avengers and Devastators. Like, this deck needs to win before any of that's going to happen. So it fits in this pillar. It's been a pretty powerful deck that you should check out and need to be prepared for, especially the DJ Tech combo. You do not want to get your resource stolen and then destroyed, especially if it's going to like brick your leader flip. That's devastating. And this is a Boba Green deck. This had a pretty high finish, I think 3rd or 4th place, day 3 at Gen Con by Alex Hancock. This is a grindier version of Boba. Now, personally, I would still be playing Energy Conversion Lab in my Boba deck. I still want to dig a little more into the aggression factor and the tempo-based factor of the Boba deck. So I like playing the Forlom Zuckuss combo with Energy Conversion Lab in my deck so that the Zuckusses get even more powerful if they don't have Forlom. But again, I'd still put that version of that deck in this pillar of small mid-range decks that are definitely the reactive decks when played against the ones in the aggro pillar, but are still like pretty aggressive in nature and definitely want to end games pretty quickly. All right, so we talked a lot about small mid-range. We got big mid-range here, and this is kind of a pillar that I don't think is like super well represented right now. I think some stuff needs to change in how these decks are constructed. I only have slightly started dabbling in this pillar in general. I don't usually build a lot of decks here. I think this is kind of an area where you are usually better off either just going into the control decks or building into more aggressive strategies. But there is something going on here that I think is decent, and these decks are very good at grinding. The hero versions especially, these are green hero mid-range, which means they're featuring cards like U-Wing Reinforcements and Home One, which are incredibly grindy cards that present tons of card advantage. I think in the case of both of these decks, I would be looking to play Energy Conversion Lab in them. Now, I know I talk about that card a lot. I think that card is actually underrated somehow, even though it used to be one of the most highly rated cards in the game. But I think sort of what these decks struggle with sometimes is just losing tempo too early in the game. And Energy Conversion Lab can do a very good job at taking tempo back. These decks have good units to ambush. I talked about General Riken in my previous video, a card that is an absolute bomb as an Energy Conversion Lab target. In blue, you have something like Rose Tico, who could be a 4/8 for 4 when she ambushes. You've got even like Obi-Wan is not a bad ambush unit if he can clear something and then leave behind a Sentinel body. And then you can always add some units that like maybe aren't the best ambush units or like the most high value. But if you're gonna play Energy Conversion Lab, I usually want like at least 4 units that like you're happy to ambush with, but often more. But like these decks also play green, so Consortium Star Viper against aggro is a pretty good ambush unit, clearing things like A-Wing and Red 3. So that's my first opinion would be to like try playing these decks with Energy Conversion Lab and then like building them to best utilize Energy Conversion Lab. But that doesn't mean you need 10 cards to do that. 3 General Rikens and then like 3 of some other card that maybe would be good to ambush, or some mix, I think would probably get you there. But these decks are both very grindy, right? The hero ones, they both have that similar top end. Blue obviously can grind even more with things like Luke and Obi-Wan. These decks can play tech, of course. Han gets to that grind state a little quicker because of the built-in ramp it has. It also has the addition of like the Han unit as a very good reactive card. And it has discard, Spark of Rebellion, which is very powerful. And that's like where the difference is, right? Like blue gets these like better chunky units. Yellow has more broad range interaction where like bounce, discard. Yeah, so that's those two. As far as the villain versions, these are major ramp decks. I think these are often not considered mid-range decks, but they're definitely mid-range for me. They're not particularly controlling decks. Obviously, when they're playing against aggro decks, they have to just like do everything in their power to like stem the bleeding, throw every unit they have and every possible removal they have in their deck, and just like chuck it at units. But these decks function at their best when they become the aggressors, especially when they're able to ramp early enough to start presenting major threats. These decks do not grind well against blue villain decks because they don't play Super Laser Blast and Avenger, but they do get under those villain decks because their leaders are enormous and incredibly powerful. And in the case of red, they get to play things like Ruthless Raider, but even in the Palps double green case, they can do recursion packages with like command and get actually ramp even quicker. So they get to that endgame state before the Avengers can come down, and then like their leader Palpatine can just kind of hold these big ships hostage with his flip. But these decks, again, they do a lot of chip damage typically, especially when they're playing with red cards. Like the red early units, sometimes they just come in there, like the 3/1 trooper like hits for 3 once or twice, and like it starts piling damage on against control decks, which are not trying to like play a life gain stall game against these decks. And when you get a bunch of chip damage in, that's when like the Ruthless Raider really is the nail in the coffin. But yeah, these are like the big ramp decks in the format, Darth Vader and Palpatine. And they have really, really massive leaders and just like generically powerful top ends. And that's how they try to close out their games. They're kind of slow. They're kind of clunky sometimes, but they do pack a punch. Here's a version of Mono Green Palp. This was from a few weeks ago. It won an event. I think it was a 1K, but I'm not entirely sure. It's by Mickey D. I've actually talked to Mickey D a bit. Again, suggesting maybe we pivot into Energy Conversion Lab here too and give this deck a little more early game punch. I'm not entirely convinced that losing that 5 health but gaining that ambush would actually make it worse into hard aggro, especially if you can use that ambush with like your lackeys as a 4-drop 5/5 to clear something really important early on, or even your phase 3 trooper, if that can ambush into a Sabine and leave behind a 4/2 sentinel, could be really strong. You obviously have Black Suns here that can ambush into A-Wings. So I think there's definitely room to look at ECL here, but doesn't have to be, right? This is still like big ramp, right? This is the 9 ramp deck. This is trying to get huge as quickly as possible, and then look at all that big stuff, right? Vader's, Reinforcement Walkers, Relentless Devastator. It's a lot, especially when you got 3 commands in your deck too, to recur them if you need it. Here is a version of Luke Green. This was just from this weekend. It finished top 4 at a 1K. Just wanted to give it as a sample. I have not played with this deck, but it is kind of how most Luke decks I've seen are being built right now, right? It's U-Wing Home 1. Obviously, you bring in the Lukes. You got Obies. You've got like an early game that's trying to stem bleeding, right? This featuring 9 turn 2 Sentinels. I think the removal package in this deck is probably a little too heavy. 3 Vanquish, 2 Rivals Fall. I'd probably have at most like 1 of that pile. So I would definitely have like cheaper removal. I'd be playing Felder Dragons, and then probably some more units in that spot. But that is very chunky removal that probably makes this better into like control decks if it's trying to beat those more consistently. But again, like I mentioned, I would try this with Energy Conversion Lab and see if that can help flip board states that the deck falls behind in. And this deck does tend to fall behind early in a lot of situations. All right, into soft control. We got Kira Energy Conversion Lab. Now I made a almost hour-and-a-half video guide on this deck. Not going to spend too much time on it. I think it's maybe the safest choice into an open field right now. You can play these blue-green villain decks as 30 health bases too. So like I'm mentioning like the Krennic 30 health here as well. I think Kira is just better than Krennic. I really liked Krennic in the previous set. It's no hate on him. I just think Kira is the better leader for this sort of strategy. But you can play her with 30 health as well. I like Energy Conversion Lab, so play Energy Conversion Lab most likely, but would be open to a switch if I thought that the 30 health would really shore up some weak matchups. Han Blue is a deck that is making huge strides now. Just this last week, there were like 400 videos made on this deck, but I would want to shout out a few of them. I know my buddy Matty Gem from KTOD made a guide. My buddies at Late Night Gaming did a masterclass featuring Sinatra, Tibbets, and Frank And Frank was actually the one that piloted their deck to a top 4 finish at Gen Con. So check that out. And I think Unplayable's D-House made a video guide on this. I made one myself a few weeks ago. The deck has changed a bit since I made that guide, but a lot of information in there is also applicable. And I'm sure there's more out there. It is a very popular deck. It's a very powerful deck. It is another one of those decks that I would say lives in that 50-50 range. Now, that's an arbitrary number, but what I mostly mean by that is I don't think it really gets blown out by a lot. I think it's got game into most decks. So if you don't like playing a deck that's like, I'm folding this matchup or I'm folding that matchup and I'm gonna smash this one, but you rather live more in that middle ground where you don't have any auto losses, that Han deck is quite good. We'll talk about that a little more in a second. I mentioned the Krennic. Palpatine Blue, not a very popular deck right now, but one that I'm working on quite a lot. And it is goal here is to just be the bigger version of like the Kira deck. Obviously, as Palpatine, you are going to lose points into Sabine, but if you can gain points basically everywhere else, then I think you got to look at that. And the Blue Palp is definitely the control deck when compared to like the Mono Green and the Red Green. I think it also has the best chance at fighting a Sabine because it gets to play cards like Vigilance and Power of the Dark Side and Make an Opening and the Client and Top Targets, especially Top Targets. That card is insane. So that's why I'm gravitating towards like a Blue Palp. All right, so yep, probably seen this deck a bunch. It's very good. Kira ECL or Kira in general is the kind of control deck that gets points into like all the mid-range stuff, can outgrind other control decks, can outgrind all the big mid-range decks, and then also doesn't scoop to Sabine because you've got this early leader deploy that can flip a board. And here is the red-blue Han. This list is the one from Gen Con. I was mostly featuring decks from there when I could find it. It is a grindy deck, right? It plays also a lot of Smuggle. Just innately, it's got Cassian, Chewbacca from the Smuggle row, and the techs. And then once the techs come in, everything can Smuggle. This deck tries to get card advantage through discard and Smuggle, right? So things like Force Throw, Pillage, K2 can create 2-for-1s when your opponent is using removal or trades. And then the Smuggle cards create 2-for-1 because you're not spending cards. Where it doesn't do as much is usually creating 2-for-1s with its units until it gets to like the really big ones like Luke and Mace and Chewbacca, right? So that's how it bridges that mid game through discard to get card advantage, and then through its big units to create 2-for-1s. And then when the games grind super long, you've got the techs to really be the nail in the coffin. The early removal is, it's damage based, Carabas and Open Fire. That you can play like takedowns and Fell the Dragons and Rivals Fall, of course. But this is definitely digging more into like early game damage removal, which does sometimes make it a little weak into shields. So something that you might want to consider there. Obviously, there's Make an Opening here in the sideboard as well as additional takedown. So I think they are respecting that a bit, but might need to respect it a little more, especially if they want to get more points into like Boba decks that are playing like Crafties and 7th Fleet, and then maybe things like Evazin show up as well, or cards like Jetpack getting thrown into those decks, which would be even more problematic for the damage-based removals. But I think this kind of fits more into control, right? Because this is in no way ever going to end the game particularly quickly unless the stars absolutely align for it. And it can grind with the control decks like Kira, which is why I put it here, right? I don't think the decks in the big mid-range pillar that I showcased can grind particularly well into the soft control decks like Kira and Palpatine. But this deck can, because it plays way more Smuggle, it plays a lot of discard, and a lot of its built-in units are 2-for-1s and at the later stage of the game. So it can kind of keep up with the card advantage and present enough problems that it doesn't just lose when things like Avenger come down and like the board gets controlled that way. All right. Hard control. So this is really all I got right now. And this, I think, is probably the least represented pillar and definitely needs a little bit of a makeover in general. I don't have showcases like for these decks. I'm not going to really feature much about them. They are not performing particularly well right now in any way, shape, or form in the metagame. But this pillar still exists, so it's something I wanted to talk about. I think these decks are just having issues now that they're just not able to like close games reasonably well, and now everyone's playing, like even Sabine decks are playing chunky giant units that demand very specific removal. Everyone's playing out of the smuggle row in general, so the card advantage engines that these decks were trying to create through like a super laser blast, just catching them up, isn't really cutting it. Like these decks are primarily 1-for-1 removal decks, and that is not something that is particularly working right now. Now, the yellow Boba can play something like Enticing Reward, the bounty, which is very powerful to kind of try to get card advantage that way. But these decks still just have a problem in the sense that they're not winning grindy games as reliably as they should be. So I don't really currently have many ideas for how to fix that. But it's something I wanted to just throw out there. And of course, if you play against these decks, you need to be aware what's happening. These decks are 1-for-1 removal decks. They have a lot of healing, especially the mono blue Iden. They sometimes will throw things like Entrenched, or in the yellow version, Frozen in Carbonite. So they'll have upgrade based removal. So you might need to look at Upgrade Hate, another thing that is kind of just incidentally around, especially with Pose, which weakens those removal. Especially like how powerful Entrench was in the first set, just being able to shut down leaders. It's not as reliable anymore. And then their endgame state, especially for non-aggro decks, is often them trying to Vigilance mill out. So that's something, again, you need to look at. You need to be aware that that may happen. But in general, these aren't very popular decks right now. So I'm not going to spend too much time here. All right, that's mostly it. Just some final thoughts. I think the most powerful pillars right now are the aggro, small mid-range, and soft control. Those are kind of the main three, the ones that have the most powerful decks. I think right now, if you were going to prep and you were like, I only have time to prep 5, for instance, my 5 for you would be Sabine Green, Boba Yellow, Mono Yellow Boba, Kira ECL, Red Blue Young Han, and Mono Yellow Han from the small mid-range. Those would be the 5 decks that I would most think will be represented at a large event in the highest numbers. So past that, obviously all that other stuff is live. There's game to it, and best prepare for everything so you have an idea of how those matchups play. Even if you think you're favored, it's good to know how the texture of those games plays out so that you don't get caught off guard by something. All right, so thanks for listening. Click that like button, subscribe, and until next time, take care.